understand what's really happening today, it's impossible to do it without a grasp for the historical context. And it even goes back before World War II. This really goes back to the World War I period, which is almost never talked about anymore. The Ottoman Empire controlled that part of the world, and it wasn't divided into nation states. There weren't all these artificial boundaries. It was the Arab world under the Ottoman Empire. What happened when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, because of European desires to see the Ottoman Empire collapse, was a takeover of the Middle East by European interests and then by the United States. And that's when these boundaries, many of which are artificial, many of which have no real relevance to the historical situation in the Middle East, came into play. For instance, take the boundary between Kuwait and Iraq, which brought us to the war in '91. The reality is that Kuwait is the 19th province of Iraq. Now, whether that justifies Saddam's policies or whether that justifies the royal family, the emir, that isn't the point. The point is that the people in that part of the world see a connection between Iraq and Kuwait, which is not irrelevant to them. And we in the West like to say that these boundaries and these countries must be established the way they are because that's the way we want them to be. In reality, in many cases, the legitimacy is highly questioned, which brings us to Palestine, Israel in the 40s. In the 30s and 40s, the Zionist movement was growing, but all was said to the Arabs, we do not intend to displace you, we do not intend to set up an independent Jewish state, we want to live in peace and brotherhood with you, but we must bring the refugees and the European Jews who want to come to live here to this place, which was then called, everybody called it, Palestine. The British at the time were the administering agents, which went back to the mandate of the League of Nations. And the British played it both ways. On the one hand, they helped the Zionist movement. On the other hand, they said they were helping the Arabs. The reason they said that was they wanted both parties to look to Britain for legitimacy and for support. But after World War II, the situation changed. The British were an exhausted empire. They were unable to handle the administration of the Palestine region. So what happened at that point was essentially a civil war broke out between the Jewish community, which then had the terrible onus of the Holocaust on its shoulders and bringing the straggling refugees from Europe. Had I been alive at the time, I'm sure I would have been involved in helping bring destitute European Jews to Palestine. But why were they coming to Palestine? They were coming to Palestine because nobody else in the world would take them. They were coming to Palestine because the United States and Britain and everybody else had closed the doors to these refugees and had said to the Arabs, you take these refugees. We're going to dump them all on your shoulders. So if you realize that it was a civil war that broke out in Palestine in the mid-1940s, right after World War II, and we are still living with the ramifications of that civil war. All that's taking place today in terms of the occupied territories, in terms of making deals between the PLO and Israel, in terms of who has administration here versus who has administration there, that's because this is really one country. Whether you call it the Holy Land, whether you call it Palestine, even whether you call it Israel, it doesn't really change the reality that this is one geographic entity that has many claims placed on it. The claim of Zionism, which grew much stronger in the post-World War II world after the Holocaust. The claim of Arab nationalism, which had been put under by the Ottomans, had been pushed under by the British, now was pushed under by the Zionists and the Americans. So I think I've exhausted the couple of minutes you gave me, but it's so important to understand this context, because if you then see today's events within the larger dynamic of how we got to today's events, it's much easier to understand why the various groups are fighting in the various ways, not having given up struggles that we in the West kind of say they should have given up, but it's really not for us to. Hamas, for instance, let me just take a minute on Hamas. Hamas is not a bunch of crazy Arab radicals killing Jews and refusing peace agreements. Hamas is a legitimate expression of Islamic national interests that goes back a long, long time, into the Ottoman period, in fact. And they refuse what they consider to be an agreement which subjugates them, which places them on reservations, which puts them in a Bantustan situation, which leaves the Israeli empire thriving and vibrant, and is supposed to then have Palestinian police, or as the Chicago Tribune a few days ago said, Palestinian cops, taking care of them. Now, I don't share anything theologically with the people in Hamas. I have met some of them by accident on the many trips that I've taken, over 100 trips to Israel and Palestine in the last 15 years. I find them very dignified people, very thoughtful people, people very aware of their history and their heritage, people fighting for their self-determination, for their freedom, for their dignity, just as other people in other parts of the world fight for theirs. But here in the United States especially, we cast them as crazies and terrorists and renegades and killers. You know, we actually do to them the same thing that we did for 20 years to the PLO. And it's time to get beyond all these stereotypes and understand that people have legitimate grievances that they're fighting for, and these legitimate grievances have to all be dealt with if our goal is a stable and just peace. The current agreement, the agreement that was signed in Washington and then in Cairo, you know, those who are in power tend to represent things as breakthroughs, as significant historic events. They want credit for these events, of course. That's the nature of politicians. But the nature of independent analysts and the nature of people who don't have a political axe to grind should be different. They should be to say what is really happening as opposed to what we're told is happening. This agreement has been in the process for 15 or 20 years. The Israeli Labor Party has always been committed to what it has called the Alon Plan. The Alon Plan was named after Foreign Minister Alon in the 60s, I believe, that the population centers of the Palestinian areas should be taken over by Palestinians in the context of Jordanian sovereignty, but the resources and the land and the security aspects of all this territory should be left under Israeli domination. Now, the Israelis tried for a long time to find Palestinians who would cooperate with their vision of what Palestine should be. They set up village leagues, which didn't work. They held elections, which didn't work. They tried this, they tried that. All right. Then the Intifada broke out 7 years ago, this uprising for independence. Up until then, there had always been a sort of a low-grade Intifada. There had never been an acceptance by the Palestinians of Israeli occupation. And that occupation, by the way, is extremely brutal. We're not talking about the fact that the Israeli army is just there, you know, policing traffic. The Israeli army is involved in terrible forms of torture, terrible forms of repression, terrible forms of intimidation, and has been for a very long time. Outrageous in terms of what the Israelis say they stand for. And that's why American Jews like myself have been so impelled to speak up against it. When the Intifada broke out, there was a need somehow for public relations reasons, and also because Israelis were being killed and the rebellion was causing Israel a great deal of heartache. There was a need to do something about it. But the Israelis couldn't find any way to do it. Then there was a major change with the Gulf War. The Gulf War, for the first time, brought the United States front and center into the Middle East. It made it clear that the client regimes in the major countries were not popularly based regimes, but were regimes kept in power because the United States kept them there. The Gulf War, in a sense, changed the whole configuration. On top of that, the Cold War ended. So you no longer had the Arab states playing the Soviet Union off against the United States. In the last couple years, the American government has been saying to the Israeli government, you've got to do something. There's just too much upheaval, too much protest, not to mention that the Arab regimes are telling us that this is tremendously harming their own legitimacy and causing the possibility of tension and revolution in their own societies. Now, we, the United States government, do not want to see revolution in these countries, which, by the way, really means democracy in these countries, because all of these countries are held in bondage by regimes that were placed there either by the British or by ourselves, none of which have any popular legitimacy, and all of which are involved in forms of intimidation and repression of their own population. The Saudi regime, the regime in Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, police states like Syria, military police states like Egypt, what's happening in Algeria, where you had a fundamentalist revolution that tried to come to power through elections, and then the military, with the help of the American CIA, called the elections off. So finally, the PLO was on its deathbed. Yasser Arafat's PLO had disintegrated. His legitimacy had been undermined by Hamas, which has more popular support in Palestine than does his PLO. His financing had been cut off by the Arab regimes, which were now indebted to the United States for having saved the status quo in the Gulf and having destroyed the Iraqi army and returned the emir to his throne in Kuwait. The PLO essentially had been defeated, which is what the Israelis and the Americans had been attempting to do for a great long time. Well, on the other hand, the Israelis needed somebody to deal with. They needed some Palestinian entity to try to create this police force situation with. Well, they tried to negotiate with the team from the occupied territories, but the team from the occupied territories was unwilling to sign the deals that the Israelis wanted to offer them. Then they found that their only option was to get Yasser Arafat to sign these deals. Now, why did he sign them? Arafat had always said he wouldn't. Arafat had ordered the negotiating team never to sign those kinds of deals. But when he was faced with his own loss of power and the total collapse of the PLO, and he was literally within weeks or months of that, he had no funds, there was rebellion in the ranks, there had been defections from the leadership of the PLO. Arafat obviously decided that he was going to choose personal survival over institutional policies. And he agreed that he, in a sense, would become governor of the occupied territories on behalf of the, call it if you will, to give it a name, the imperial power, the hegemonic power, which would be Israel backed by the United States. I suspect, if he were here commenting, and I know Yasser Arafat and have had dinner with him a number of times, met him a number of times, he would say, this is the best we could do. We're defeated people, we're vanquished people, this is the best we could do. And he would say, we're still hoping for a Palestinian state, we're still planning to move ahead, and we expect more to come of this. But that's not very likely. The Palestinians have given up their trump cards. The Arab world is a defeated world politically. You can think of the agreement that has just been made. Think of it in these terms. In '67, the Arab world was defeated militarily on the battlefield. In the '90s, Arab nationalism, Palestinian nationalism, has been defeated diplomatically at the negotiating table. And that's why you see so much tension within the Palestinian community. That's why even the negotiators who Arafat sent to Washington and to negotiate with the Israelis did not come to the ceremony at Washington or in Cairo. The American press doesn't tell these things very easily, but the majority of the negotiators were not in Cairo. I know that for sure. And at least the head of the negotiating team, Dr. Abdul Shafi, refused to come to the ceremony in Washington. So you have an agreement, but the agreement contains within it its own destructive tendencies, if not its own undoing. The Israelis, I believe, think they win either way. The Israelis think that if the police force really does its job, and our settlements can stay, and we can turn over administrative duties to the Palestinians, and they will police their own areas, without our having to give up sovereignty over these areas and without their claiming independence in these areas, then that's wonderful. We Israelis have accomplished a great goal. We are in charge, but they take care of their day-to-day affairs. It's more likely, I think, that there will be civil war, tension, violence, in which case maybe even Yasser Arafat won't be with us. In that case, the Israelis say to the world, what more can we do? We tried so hard. We even negotiated with the PLO. We even made this agreement, to work with the Palestinian people. In which case, many people in the world, not familiar with the intricacies of the history of this problem and the regional and political dynamics of this problem, many people will also throw up their hands and say, well, what more can we do about this problem? Well, the answer really is quite simple. All these years, what many people have been saying is that if you want a just peace, that just peace has to give legitimate fulfillment to the aspirations of the people who are in conflict. In the context of Israel and the Palestinians, that means at minimum 2 sovereign, independent states. Not one state dominating over the other, not one state promoting a police force that represents a faction of the other, but 2 states, 2 nationalisms, 2 historic fulfillments, both claiming all of historic Palestine, but each at least given the attributes of its independence and national dignity, lacking being able to have control of the entire area. That's not what this agreement is about. That's what the agreement many of us have been advocating would be about. In fact, the current agreement is designed to make sure that the other kind of agreement doesn't come into play. But there's one more crucial element to this, if I may, and that's the very nature of the regimes in the region. What the Americans and the Israelis are trying to do with this agreement is essentially to create one more Arab client state. That means they're trying to convert the PLO of Yasser Arafat, a faction of the current Palestinian movement, into the client regime that does our bidding, accepts our funding, is dependent on us, meaning the United States and the West, for its legitimacy and for its survival. Now, having done that successfully in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, with the Hashemite government of Jordan, having failed in Iran, but then again there were all those years where we did have a client regime, the Shah of Iran. We all forget that they were the linchpin of stability in the Gulf not that long ago. We also tried it in Iraq. There was a monarch from the Hashemite clan that was installed by the British with American backing in the 50s in Baghdad. A revolution pushed that regime out. So what is really going on here, think of it in these terms, is that the Americans and the Israelis took the shell of the PLO, bankrupt, defeated, destitute, nowhere to go, and offered that shell, you become our client regime in Palestine. We will then supply you with used trucks and military equipment. We will supply you with funds to pay your soldiers. We will supply you with covert intelligence capabilities so you can monitor what the other groups are doing, just like we do for the Saudis and the Hashemites and others in the region. We certainly have been doing this for the Egyptians ever since Camp David was signed. You, in return, must agree to give up the struggle, must agree to police yourselves, must agree not to cause the Israelis difficulties, and must agree, in a sense, to accept American-Israeli domination of regional affairs. Now, if you put it in those terms, it becomes a lot easier to understand why self-respecting and dignified Palestinians don't find that arrangement a very desirable one. Their fight has not been over whether they could have a few crumbs of self-rule or autonomy. Their fight has been over independence and sovereignty. Their fight has been over a Middle East where Israel wasn't the only nuclear superpower, always threatening to take out Arab capitals if there should be another war. Their fight is over a culture and a way of life that is grounded in the Islamic traditions that they know, not in Western traditions with prime ministers and kings that come out of armies that are trained in American camps, or prime ministers who were trained at British or American universities. They want legitimate expressions of their own culture and their own civilization, which, by the way, is a very rich and very deep civilization, which you go back to another time in history, was far advanced over the European civilization. But that time is certainly gone for the present. One little story, if I may. About 3 years ago, I was in Saudi Arabia, and it was an unplanned meeting, very late at night, that I'd been asked to come to, about 1 o'clock in the morning, actually. A room full of Saudi intellectuals. And the discussion began. They weren't aware that I was coming to their weekly meeting. I'd been invited by a newspaper to give a talk that night and then invited after to this meeting. The discussion went on. The war was in its early stages. The Americans were building up forces to attack Iraq. And I said, similar things to what have been said in this interview. And across the room, a man I never met and still don't know, hadn't said a word all night. I'd been there for maybe an hour. The man looks up at one point. He's smoking his pipe. And the moment he starts speaking, perfect English. I learned later he'd been educated in the States. And he simply said the following. He said, "Mr. Bruzonsky, it's our great pleasure that you've come to be with us this evening. And please allow me to only correct one thing that you've said." Now, I expected all hell to break loose. I thought this was the polite Arab way of saying, "Okay, now let me tell you something." And all he said was, he didn't mention a word about Iraq, the war, regimes. All he said was, "Mr. Bruzonsky, this evening, a number of times I have heard this word dignity, and you have used this word. You will go home in a few days, and let me tell you one thing that you should remember. This word dignity of which you have spoken, this word no longer can be found in the dictionary of the Arabs." And I thought it was just a masterful summary. That without saying anything quotable about the current issues of the day, he had said everything. And that's, in the end, what these fights from Algeria to the streets of Cairo to the camps of Palestine, that's what this is all about. Dignity. Assertion of one's own culture, one's own values, one's own self-determination. And that's what our revolution was about. Why did we have the Boston Tea Party? Why didn't we like the redcoats running around in our streets? Because we wanted our own dignity. We wanted to rule ourselves. We wanted our own new culture that wasn't the British culture. It was the American culture to be dominant. We didn't want to have, like the Canadians accepted to have, the Queen of England as the Queen or King of America. We wanted to have the United States of America. And that's why the Arab world is in turmoil. Because, to go back to the history part, after World War I, they were promised independence. Not independence as a little entity here, a little entity here with false borders, this one ruled by France, this one ruled by England. But independence as the Arab world. Now, that desire for independence was stolen from them by the 1918 conference in Paris, the peace conference, where the famous Lawrence of Arabia was there and Emir Faisal was there. And in those years, the whole idea of Arab sovereignty, Arab independence, a United States of Arabia, if you want to think of it in that way, that was taken from them. Instead, they ended up with mandates carved into borders that had no historical legitimacy other than the fact that Britain wanted its piece, France wanted its piece, and others were interested in other pieces. The Americans came in after World War II and buttressed this system that had been created by the Europeans. We did so because we were the surviving great power after World War II. The British and the French had lost their empires. And what do we get for it? What we get for it is cheap oil prices so that our economy can live at an artificially high standard of living. We get plentiful oil at cheap oil prices from the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, and others. We get petrodollars that flow back to American banks rather than get invested in Arab institutions. The deal is actually pretty simple. We help keep those regimes in power, which also means we help them repress their own people, and we help them fight against the democratic and Islamic trends within their own cultures. And in return for that, we get lots of oil at very low prices. We get AT&T to go build the biggest contract ever for telecommunication systems in Arabia. We get Boeing airplanes sold in the billions of dollars to the Gulf countries instead of other countries getting their airplanes sold there. And at a price which is difficult to explain, but the price is the price of independence, dignity, self-determination for the peoples who live there. And maybe with this kind of an explanation, it's a little easier for Americans to understand why all the turmoil, why all the hatred, why all the bombs, why all the guns, not to mention the World Trade Tower and other things that still may happen in our country. We claim to be in the forefront of the fight for democracy and freedom and free markets and self-determination. But in reality, we are the most repressive force in the Middle East region, and the people in the Middle East know this. By maintaining the kinds of divisions and the kinds of conflicts, regional conflicts in the region, who has benefited the most by this? America is a corporate state with a huge military industry. Who is the largest salesman of arms to the Middle East? Of course, it's the United States. Who is the largest provider of training to the militaries of the Middle East? Of course, it's the United States. Who are the militaries of the Middle East really preparing against? They were never preparing to fight Israel. If so, they would have been able to defeat Israel. Israel is 3.5 million Jews. The Arab world is 22 countries and 200 million people. Their armies are used to fight against their own people. The purpose of the armies in the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, in the Saudi kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in the Ba'athist-run Syria and the Ba'athist-run Iraq, for that matter, the purpose of these armies is to keep in power the various client regimes that were originally set up by, in most cases, if not all cases, by the British, and then sort of taken over as clients by the Americans. Now, a veneer of democracy is sometimes placed over to give the impression, when arguments of this kind are raised, that, well, these people are on the way to democracy, but, you know, they don't have any traditions of this kind, and we have to sort of teach them how to do it, and it's taking a long time. Well, all of that is a fig leaf at best and hypocrisy at worst. Take the case of Egypt. Egypt had a revolution. It threw out its king in the 50s. A military government came to power. That military government then led to a civilian government. But who has always headed the civilian government? It's always been a former general from the army who is dressed up in a suit and trotted out, usually in front of Western cameras, to make speeches. And they go through the pretense of elections, but everybody knows who's going to be elected. And the United States says that, you know, this is acceptable democracy and human rights. But if you go to these countries, you find that there's a huge police state apparatus which is controlling each of these countries, and each of these police state, military state apparatuses are trained either in Britain or the United States. Everybody over there knows that. Look at what just happened in Egypt last week. A couple of thousand lawyers, of all people, lawyers, were demonstrating on the streets because another lawyer had been taken into custody and beaten to death by the security services of the government of Egypt. Well, this has been going on for a long time, but it usually doesn't happen to journalists or lawyers or, you know, nice people like that. It usually happens to people who don't have any means of defending themselves other than to attack using terrorism. In this case, the government of Egypt was so weak that it wouldn't even let the lawyers protest on the street. It beat and gassed the lawyers. Why did it do that? It did that because it wants everyone in Egypt to understand that any form of protest on the streets, no matter who it is by, is not going to be tolerated. The regime is too weak to allow that kind of thing to happen. Saudi Arabia is, you know, it's a family, the Saudi royal family. There are no attributes of democracy of any kind. Same thing in Kuwait, although there is this parliament now, but that was, you know, set up to give a veneer of legitimacy in the wake of the Iraqi invasion. What does this mean for the United States? Well, in the short term, it means economic benefits. It means that, as I said once before, our standard of living is kept artificially high because the prize of the 20th century, oil, huge amounts of oil to run our industrial society, is made available to the United States in huge quantities at artificially low prices. That greases our society, but there's another aspect to it, that once large amounts of money had been transferred to these societies for the cheap oil, there were petrodollar reserves. Now, where do these petrodollar reserves go? They don't go to building the infrastructure of modern societies. They don't go for building the Arab world and setting up new institutions and setting up, for instance, an aircraft industry to compete with our aircraft industry. They're as large a society, more than 200 million as we are. Instead, these amounts are recycled back to American corporate banks, and then these amounts are used to purchase the supply of things that many people in those societies don't think they need. They don't need another round of huge military equipment. They don't need, right, take Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia already has a very modern Boeing Saudi Airlines. They don't need to purchase huge amounts of the very latest, unless, of course, they're being encouraged to do so as a political financial trade-off for our having come to their defense and prevented the region, first from being swept away by the tide of Islamic fundamentalism that everyone was afraid of after the Iranian Revolution, and then by the secular Ba'athist power of Iraq, which the real goal of Saddam was not really Kuwait, which we Americans, by the way, had encouraged him to think he'd be able to take over without our opposition. My own supposition, we have no way of proving this to anyone's satisfaction, my own supposition is that the Israelis and the Americans played Saddam for the fool, creating the very conditions by which he decided to go into Kuwait. And it wasn't just a matter of saying to him, we probably aren't going to do anything about it. In the years before the invasion of Kuwait, the United States had encouraged Kuwait to pursue oil and economic policies which were extremely antagonistic to Iraq. If you go back and examine the history of the years before, you'll see all kinds of oil policies, financial policies, oil supply policies, petrodollar policies, which harmed Iraqi interests, and in which Iraq had said publicly that what is taking place now is harming the national interests of Iraq. Well, when the United States makes statements like it's harming the national interests of the United States, we know what happens. There are invasions of Grenada, and there are invasions of Panama, and now maybe there'll be an invasion of Haiti. And then, of course, there was the harm to the national interests, so that we invaded Saudi Arabia and then attacked Iraq. We apparently don't believe that other countries are entitled to have legitimate national interests of their own. The same thing when it comes to Israel and nuclear weapons. We helped Israel develop its nuclear weapons. We, the United States, created the arms race in the Middle East. Now we say to the Arabs, to the Pakistanis, to the North Koreans, that you're not allowed to have nuclear weapons because the international community has decided. Of course, we run the international community on the whole, and if we don't like what they do, we don't pay our bills at the UN. But look at it from an Arab point of view. Why should an Arab say, we 200 million Arabs are not allowed to have modern weapons, which are the token, the currency of power and influence, but your ally Israel, 3.5 million Jews, which works closely with you, they are allowed to have these weapons and to intimidate us with them. Now, from that point of view, it does look a little incongruous, and it certainly is. The benefits to the United States are thus considerable in terms of economic and financial incentives. But there's another price to be paid, and that's the price of growing hatred and growing feelings of American hypocrisy. Let me just tell another little personal story. And maybe these personal stories are key to someone like myself coming here and being interviewed like this. Egypt. About 6-7 years ago, I knew a young man about my age, he's a businessman, PhD from MIT, engaged in computerization in Egypt. In fact, that's the context in which I knew him, since I know something about this as well. One day, we'd known each other a week or two, he suggests we go off and have a drink. All right, he chooses a hotel downtown, one of the older classic hotels. We sit down. He's a modern guy, coat and tie. We order some drinks, alcoholic drinks. He's not a fundamentalist. And he says, would you mind if we didn't talk about computers and things today? would prefer if we talked about my country and what's happening here. And I said, I'm relieved, you've made my day. And without any further to do, I guess this was his way of testing and shocking me at this point. He said, look, do you realize how much hatred exists in my country for your country? I said, I probably don't realize it to the extent that you do, but yes, I do realize it, and yes, that's why I don't think the policies being pursued by my country in the long run are going to be good for U.S.-Arab relations. Anyway, you don't expect that to come from someone of that kind. And he wouldn't have said that to a visiting person who was being hosted by the U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce, and he wouldn't have said that to somebody at the American Embassy. That was his way of establishing his own dignity, of establishing his own independence, of having a dialogue with, I hope, someone he'd come to respect about what's really happening in the infrastructure to Egypt, because he knew at that time that it looks good on the surface. There are more roads and the phones work better and things like that, but underneath there's this real tension. And that tension has led to the last couple years of extreme violence in Egypt, which is hardly over. I think we're just sort of in the early phases of it. The end of the Cold War is the backdrop for the way things are taking place in the Middle East today. The weak Arabs, the divided Arabs, when there was a bipolar world, could use the Soviets to play off against the Americans. Nasser tried it in the 50s. He said to the West, you're not going to build the Aswan Dam? I'm going to the Soviets. Sure enough, the Soviets built the Aswan Dam. He said, you're not going to arm the Egyptian army? We're going to go to the Soviets. And sure enough, that's what took place in that phase of history. At this phase in history, there only is one military superpower. The Russians love to come to the ceremonies and love to pretend that they're still a superpower, but, they know the reality of the situation. They do not have the liberty to go very far in opposition to what the United States is planning to do. Plus, for the Soviets, oil was never really a problem for them. They are the second largest producer of oil now, and up until their own demise, were the first largest producer of oil. So to a certain extent, the Middle East doesn't represent the same economic interest to them as it represents to us, although it does represent strategic interests that they've always been interested in. The Europeans are a somewhat different case. History has reversed itself. It was the Europeans that created the client regimes, the Europeans that drew the boundaries that don't make a lot of sense in the region, the Europeans that established the system of infiltrating those societies and figuring out how to manipulate their leaders and work with their armies and work with their intelligence services. And if you go back to World War II, you'll find that it was Roosevelt and Churchill primarily that at the same time they were allies fighting against the Germans and fighting to win World War II. They were both maneuvering under the table for who would have the economic and strategic interests in the vital Middle East region. Roosevelt didn't go to meet with Ibn Saud on the ship toward the end of the war because he needed to make another trip and go somewhere. He was already a very ill man. He went because the American corporate state was already very much interested in not only the oil resources of the region, but in the potential sales to the region. The British wanted to maintain their hold on the Middle East, but their empire was exhausted. So after World War II, what happened? Essentially, the Americans came in, and it came to a head in the Suez Crisis. In 1956, the British and the French, losing control over the region, connived with the Israelis to attack Egypt. The ruse was that the Egyptians had taken over the Suez Canal. The reality was they were very upset with Nasser, very upset with what Egypt had become, very upset with Egypt, with the Arab nationalism, and they wanted to show that, we're still in charge here. it was Eisenhower that forced the British and the French and the Israelis to retreat. And in the process of doing that, it became the symbol of, we Americans now call the shots even more than you do. You shouldn't have made this war without our permission. And since it's not quite in keeping with our interests, we're telling you to get out. All right. They got out. The Israelis were forced out of Sinai at that time. The British and the French were told to take their military and go back to where they came from. And Egypt was left in control of the Suez Canal. But the legacy, in a sense, then reversed European-American involvement. The Americans became the dominant player in the region. The Europeans became the secondary player. Economic interests didn't totally go to the United States. The British and the French and the Japanese still have some interest there, considerable interests. But America became the dominant player, plus one other huge factor. The Europeans have been busy with their own integration into their own community. They're building their own competitive economic framework to that of the United States and to that of NAFTA and to that of the American empire, if you will. It's conducted in terms of economic competition, not military competition. Our societies have evolved to the point where it's pretty unthinkable to go to military conflict with each other. But day to day, we're involved in economic conflict with each other. And it sometimes gets pretty brutal. There are threats between the U.S. and France of this kind of embargo and this kind of action. It's pretty dicey at times. But the Europeans have enough to worry about with their own community at this point so that they're not really challenging the American hold over the Middle East region. How this will evolve in the future, hard to say. There's lots of forces working in Europe. Plus, you've still got other economic challenges coming from Asia. But for the foreseeable future, I think the United States will remain relatively unchallenged as the dominant superpower that has control over the Middle East. And the challenges will come from inside Arab societies rather than from other Western societies. The very day of the Cairo Agreement, and I was asked that morning by Canadian National Television to come down to their studio, and on the way down, I was reading the New York Times. And amidst all the articles about how important this is and what a breakthrough it is, and of course I was already thinking what was I going to say, and I was going to say this is an agreement that's been prepared for a very long time, and it's in keeping with what the Israelis have wanted to do with the Palestinians. It's not quite this unprecedented breakthrough that it's being portrayed as. But I looked at the front page of the New York Times and I said to myself, my God, there's the truth of this. There's no story, there's no analysis. It's all in the picture. And there's this huge picture of the electrified fence that's being used, that's being built and completed all around Gaza, right as the Palestinian police are about to enter. Well, that tells the story. The Israelis were letting Palestinians out of their prisons, sending them to the Gaza prison. But the Gaza prison was going to be a living prison. It wasn't going to be a prison with internal barbed wire and cells, and they would have to bring the food in and take care of the prisoners. The Gaza prison, after having destroyed the economy of Gaza, after having beat these people into submission for more than a generation, was now going to be symbolized by this electrified fence. Only those Palestinians cooperative with the Israelis, with their new computerized ID cards and everything, were going to be let out of this prison. The rest were going to be bottled up inside it. And Jericho is somewhat irrelevant. Jericho is 25 square miles they've been given authority over. And it's really, they let the Palestinian PLO have Jericho because Arafat couldn't set up shop in Gaza. The PLO has minority support in Gaza. So he needed an administrative area which was quiet and small and could be policed and roped off and secured from the rest of his own people. And that's why Jericho wasn't really included in this deal. Now, the goal, as I said, is to turn over Palestinian population centers to the PLO if, on their probationary period, they can prove satisfactorily that they can control their own people on behalf of the new arrangement that's been made. I think they're going to have a terribly difficult time doing that, because at the same time that the Palestinian people were beaten into submission, and I mean literally beaten into submission, I'm not just talking about figuratively, I'm talking about every single family in occupied Palestine has had a father, a brother, a son imprisoned, tortured, broken, in many cases killed. People will think I'm exaggerating, but I am simply not. I've been there, I've seen it. Every family has been broken and subjugated in this way. The young generation of Palestinians that made the Intifada are very well aware that they did not fight to be turned into Red Indians in reservations, or to be given autonomy under Israeli sovereignty, or for that matter, to be given a Palestinian police force that was going to police them with Israeli jeeps and joint patrols following after them. I think their fight for their own independence and their own sovereignty is a very important fight, that we should be as sensitive to their needs for security and independence as we are to those of others who have better propaganda here in our country. And I think there's also an issue, whether we're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, that we should reopen. And here, of course, the Jewish community doesn't like to hear these things said, especially by American Jews. In my case, I guess I haven't mentioned it, I represented the World Jewish Congress in Washington for 7 or 8 years, worked for the American Jewish Congress. I don't have to make excuses for my own Jewish credentials and credibility, or at least I don't feel I have to. We should reopen the whole issue of partition. Palestine, the Holy Land, is a country. It has different peoples living in it, claiming different rights and claiming different historical legitimacy. We shouldn't be talking about roping one people off behind an electrified fence here, and border posts here, and checkpoints here, and this group killing this group and retreating into this area. We should be rethinking how it's possible that all the peoples who live there should live in peace and democracy with individual rights. We should be saying, for instance, if one man, one vote in South Africa, if blacks and whites are coming together to live in South Africa and we are all applauding, if we in our own country take such pride in having a homogeneous political society, even though we have distinct groups with different claims within that society, why are we then applauding the total separation of peoples in the Middle East? Why are we applauding and paying for the building of electrified fences? Why are we so pleased about agreements that have a Jewish settlement here, a Palestinian town here, and a prime minister of Israel who says we want to totally separate ourselves from each other? That's not the way it was before 1948. It's not the way that it was before the League of Nations and the UN got involved. It seems to me that what we're doing is sowing the seeds, as we did in the Balkans years ago, for more conflict and more pain and heartache in the future. And what we're doing is not consistent with our values either. Our values are secular societies built upon democratic principles. And then, when our Western leaders say to us that we have to oppose fundamentalist Islam in the Middle East because these forces look to religion as the basis of their society, well, where is the first theocratic state in modern times that was built upon a religious test? It's the state of Israel. It's the state which the United States and world Jewry brought to the Middle East and then differentiated between who was Jewish and who was Muslim and who was Christian. We are the ones who brought those concepts to the modern Middle East. And in that context, it's a bit incongruous and certainly hypocritical for us then to say the Jews are entitled to their national entity, but Muslims, who happen to be 95% of the people of this territory, are not entitled to talk about politics and religion in the same breath.